Okay, we are live.
Okay, great. Thanks, Wen. Should I start? Okay. All right, so we'll call this meeting to order. Thank you all for joining on Zoom. Just a reminder that we're also streaming this on Facebook Live, and we're going to try to run this meeting as close to how we would process-wise as if we were in person in terms of, procedures. That said, if more people join, I can't see everybody on my screen at once. I somehow can't figure out how to do that like show 49 at once thing. So if you have a piece of testimony you'd like to make and I'm not seeing your hand up or whatever it is, please feel free to put it in the chat, or if I'm really missing you, speak up. We want to make sure we hear everybody who has something to say. So with that, I'll pass it to Win or Layla for roll call.
Yep, Layla, do you want to do roll call?
You're on.
I'll do roll call. So,
thank you.
Commissioner McKenna Kaufman.
Here.
Commissioner Bettina Maynard.
Here.
Commissioner Chip Fletcher.
Here.
We have 3 commissioners. 3 meets quorum, so we have a meeting.
Okay, great. Thank you. First item on the agenda is approval of the July 14 minutes. We were all given that in advance, and I'm wondering if anybody has any edits.
None from me. Sorry about the dogs.
No, none from me either. And I have both of my dogs to my right and my left. So there will be an interruption coming, I know already. So no worries.
This has become the usual way to do work now. I kind of like that. I have no edits either. So can I get a motion to approve?
So moved. No, wait a second. I second it. No, I move it.
You move it. Chip?
I'll second it. Second.
All right, all in favor of approving?
Aye.
Aye.
Okay. Minutes from July 14th accepted. The next item on the agenda is a report on activities from the Office of Climate Change, Sustainability and Resiliency. I know that Josh had an overlapping meeting, so we're going to be moving his director's update hopefully to after Lala Nuss's presentation. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to you, Matt.
Great, thanks everybody. Set it up here. Can I just get a confirmation that you are seeing what I'm seeing, please?
Yes.
Okay.
That looks good.
Great, thanks everybody. Just want to start off by saying today is my 36th birthday, and I can't think of a better convergence of timelines than being in a position to be able to present to a duly elected office and volunteer commission on one of the most important topics of our time. So with that said,
Happy birthday, Matt.
Oh, thanks, Chip.
Yes, happy birthday, Matt.
Thanks, everybody. Today we're going to talk about a new project that the office is starting up called Climate Ready Oahu, which is our climate adaptation strategy for the island, for the city and county of Honolulu. And what I want to give today is really just a very, very, very quick overview of the scope and the process, and then some food for thought for you all.
I'm sorry, Matt. Matthew, you're fading in and out.
Oh,
Your voice is fading in and out.
I can hear just fine.
Okay, I'll proceed, but thanks for the information, Henry. So very quick scope and process. Obviously, I have some questions and requests from the commission, as this is very much related to the work that you've been doing and the guidance that you provide for us. Certainly would want to re-engage the full commission at a later date to ensure that they all are provided the same information. Really a request that perhaps at future commission meetings, there's opportunities for formal touch points with the commission. And then perhaps for future decision-making, a request for 1 or up to 2 commissioners to participate in a still as yet to be developed advisory group. And then lastly, at the bottom there, really just in your personal and professional roles and places out in community, just request helping to spread the word and get the message out there, and also to participate to your fullest extent possible. So very quickly, you probably remember that within the resilience strategy, one of the actions identified was action 28, to chart a climate resilient future by creating and implementing a strategy. And that's what we're really embarking upon today. And this is also informed by the Hawaii Freshwater Initiative and the One Water for Climate Resilience framework that you all addressed through your white paper that was recently adopted, and really the really foundational work that the Board of Water Supply has been doing to think interdepartmentally, crosswise on infrastructures, and better understand the interrelatedness of these systems to continue to serve communities into the future. A little bit oversimplified here, but we really have 2 main objectives. One, creating a risk assessment, and then obviously the strategies and the things that need to be done commensurate with the risks and opportunities provided by the assessments. One thing that we're trying to really build out, and I'm glad that Lala Nuss can join us right after this to share some of her insights from her Community Talk Story program, is really improve upon this office's work and the city's work as a whole regarding equity and process engagement, but also really focusing in on equity in implementation of anything that's identified in this work. We know that this strategy in and of itself is not going to solve all of our climate change challenges, which is why it's really important that we have some support to think about our existing planning framework, which is really the 8 community plans. So this strategy is intended to provide material and support for that process, as well as the department's functional plans. And then last but not least, really providing decision support guidance through both the budget development process and ensuring that we are consistent with all the things that are identified here. And lastly, at the bottom there, it has this mention of towards a climate resilience and hazard mitigation plan. The long-term intent is that this is kind of climate adaptation strategy 1.0, but that the hazard mitigation plan, which we know we will update on a 5-year basis as required by FEMA to be eligible for federal disaster funds. We want much more inclusion of these climate hazards and risks so that we have this new kind of hazard mitigation plan, which has additional focus on climate resilience. We've seen some great examples from other municipalities where they're much tighter knitting these 2 issues together and still going through the required FEMA process to get the plans approved and adopted. I'm very pleased to say that the lead from our consultant team is also here at the meeting today. I'll ask her to introduce herself in a second, but just so you are all aware, I'm the project manager for the office, and additionally supported directly by a team of Vistas, including Maddie, Sophie, and Ujay as listed there. This is a pretty quick project, and I think that's important to recognize that we're building off of a lot of existing work, and we really want to make sure that we're just continuing the discussion, and there's really no time to wait on this topic. ICF International is our contractor and consultant supporting us in the work, so I'd like to quickly introduce Susan Assam, who's the project lead here on Oahu.
Hi there. It's good to see a lot of your faces, especially in this COVID time where I'm not seeing a lot of your faces. So we're thrilled to be working on this with Matt and his team. We have, I think many of you know us, but not everybody. So ICF is a consulting practice. I lead our climate adaptation and resilience practice within that. We are global, and our team, as you can see, is located all over, but many of these folks have worked on Hawaii projects for the National Park Service, for Fish and Wildlife Service, for the state. So they're thrilled to be working on this climate adaptation strategy as well, and really to be pushing the envelope in terms of climate risk assessment and thinking about it, again, feeding into the hazard mitigation plan process, which is work that we've been doing with other provinces, states, cities, and other places. So we're excited to do this in Honolulu.
Great, thank you, Susan. And as you can see there, it's really twofold. We're really appreciative of ICF providing us support to really look internally and to facilitate the interdepartmental discussions as listed there. And our office is the lead on all of the external facing community engagement. Obviously, like many out there, we had to quickly pivot from doing in-person things where we had 14 island-wide open houses scheduled. The information listed here is in development, and once we have more concrete timelines and materials, we'd be happy to share that back out with the commission and the community. We will have a project-specific website launching in the near term to be really our repository and main, at least digital way to get information out as well as receive information in. So more to come on that. Here's the main project timeline, and what you see is really ICF's scope with regards to engaging city departments, and then that additional stuff down at the bottom running the entirety of the project timeline is really the public participation with specific checkpoints consistent with the work that the departments are doing, so that community has a chance to review, participate, and add insight into some of these risks, some of these downscaled adaptation focus areas, and have a pretty extended opportunity to comment on public review drafts, et cetera. The most immediate next steps are really to hone in on this climate risk assessment, building from things like the hazard mitigation plan and the great guidance that we've been provided by the Climate Change Commission. Some of these immediate outputs are to have exposure maps, detailed assessments of the specific risks, not just the climate risks, but also economic consequences. And then, as I mentioned, we really hope to support the planning department and the community plan area development process, as that's really the mechanism by which we consider neighborhood and community change through time. So really trying to further and advance that work. But as I mentioned, we're really striving to implement new practices, both honing in on equity, but also equity in climate. And I'm glad that Lala's here. She'll probably school us a little bit more on how we have opportunities to normalize, organize, and operationalize these concepts of equity in our work, and not just really, giving lip service to it, but really doing the hard work of trying to make sure that we are integrating it both in process and in implementation. And we have some background information. Data and maps are not the end all be all, but they're great starting points in the conversation. And what you see here is actually just one output from the resilience strategy, natural hazards bouncing forward working group, where they were keen on investigating some of the socioeconomic consequences as it relates to natural hazards. And we're glad that we can bring that work forward into this climate adaptation discussion. And you probably, I'm sure you all remember the final page in the 160 pages of the resilience strategy, where we tried to really highlight the need and the opportunity, where the city's plan is really the budget, and how we implement and execute work in addition to creating rules and ordinances is showing how we are structuring departments and supporting them on executing operations and maintenance, as well as the kinds of capital projects that we invest in. And that's really what we're glad that ICF can provide additional guidance and lessons learned from other municipalities, looking at how to actually implement the strategies that are being identified through budget alignment, review processes, et cetera. Because without the decision-making support and hopefully the really built up constituency through the process, these are the kinds of things that directors need and legislators need to really make the decisions to take action on the identified strategies. So very quickly trying to wrap up here, this is just to remind ourselves that there's a lot of work that's already been done. We're gonna hit the ground running with all of this. A lot of other actions in the resilience strategy allude to addressing some of the risks, whether it's sea level rise, rainfall, inundation, or heat. Looking at the combined challenges of sort of amplified and multiplied natural hazards as a result of the climate change additions, but also it's an opportunity to think a little bit more on the broad-based opportunity to put us all on the same level in terms of education and communication around climate change. We have the mayor's directive, obviously, on climate change and sea level rise, which was in direct response to this commission's guidance. And then you may not be aware, but just last month, he issued another directive really honing in on the heat stress and heat shocks, as we've developed a lot of information locally and recognizing that trees are not just beautification, but they're really critical infrastructure that allows community to get out and about. And also have the laundry list of great products that this commission has produced, as well as some of the ones that are currently under work and even being discussed today. So we want to continue to bring this work forward and show that we're taking the guidance to heart. So very quickly, the climate adaptation, obviously, as I mentioned, coastal hazards, rainfall, and high heat, that, man, communities across the country and the world are really, really challenged this summer right now. We've compiled what was previously the state sea level rise viewer and the NOAA 6-foot, which this commission reference in the guidance. We've tried to make it a little bit easier for either project applicants or community members to see this information. And just last month, we launched the Climate Ready Oahu Web Explorer, which allows people to look at a lot of this climate data all in one place. So I encourage you to explore that. And as I mentioned, the temperatures in trees within Mayor's Directive 20-14 last summer on what just happened to be the hottest day of the year and also tied the hottest record temperature ever recorded at the Honolulu Airport station. We had community members collecting temperature and humidity data, and we now have this landscape scale urban heat index, which is really important as we think about how and where to prioritize actions, how and where to restore some equity in our decision making while ensuring that we're investing in community to succeed into the future. So as I mentioned, these are the 8 community plan areas. If you're not familiar, currently the planning department is wrapping up the primary urban center, which is about Kahala through Pearl City. We've participated in that process, and we want to have additional materials so that they can very quickly bring those plans up into the contemporary times with the science and the information. And we're glad that we've had the opportunities to brief them, and they've provided good guidance and feedback on the work that we're engaging in so that we can ensure that we're supporting them in the work that they need to do. But we also want to try to elicit and really hone in on some hyper-local knowledge and hyper-local ideas and visions, while ensuring that we're also keeping this whole island geography in mind, because even if folks perhaps have a greater affinity or understanding of their ahupua'a or their moku, city government is additionally obliged to think island-wide because we're providing services for communities that are transporting across one region to another. And we need to think about contextual things, but also have the discussion on sort of on balance. You probably also have opinions about different areas of the island. So that is the work that's in front of us in terms of the community engagement. Because it's not just Honolulu, right? We need to also think about Punalu'u and everywhere in between and everywhere all around. And while the stresses and the climate science might be a little bit same, depending on some of the regions. The approaches on how we address those are perhaps a little bit more contextual in the opportunities as well as the challenges to address those things. And then just lastly, thinking about how we discuss climate and discuss change, I think there's great opportunity to really flip the script to elicit more hope and vision and opportunity to highlight correction and restoration. I think community and cultural restoration is climate adaptation, and a lot of these things of sort of, even if it's traditional neighborhood design or how we stayed socially connected in the past, or even further in the past, these concepts of ecosystem management as adapting to change are really important. And this is generational work. Here's one example of a nonprofit right on the windward side. You can find examples like this all across the island of this progression of people who have just been putting their nose to the grindstone, doing the hard work, and now starting to really come to the threshold of realizing some of these benefits of better ecosystem management, but also providing sustenance and spaces for people in their hyper-local communities. So we as a city are obliged to learn about this much more thoroughly and champion and highlight and see how we can support it and see how there are linkages with the adaptation work that's needed to come. Because I was quite taken when I was watching some old Sea Grant College Program Voice of the Sea episodes. Change is coming to us, whether we like it or not, and we don't necessarily want to just talk about it like that, because I think objectively there's a lot of opportunity to improve upon community environmental conditions. So with that hope and that vision, and knowing the science and what you are all providing to us, how do we come to the conversation with a little bit more confidence in our ability to manage change over time? And these are things that we're exploring through the engagement process and trying to elicit more of those stories or mixed media, art, poetry, etc., to really not just add them as window dressing, but people's hopes and dreams are the only way that we're going to find ways to really carry forward any of the strategies that are identified. So with that, just to recap, gave you the scope and the process. There's obviously significantly more detailed information that I can share with you all, but just some food for thought for you all moving forward. I know the full commission's not here. We would certainly welcome additional support. The climate change brief came out in 2018. I'm sure Chip has read 2,000 journal articles since then, and there's maybe little nuggets here and there from the UH Sea Level Center or elsewhere of perhaps more current information, thinking of triggers and thresholds. So we'll probably be coming back out to you on a one-on-one basis to gather any of that additional information. But also when we do get towards this advisory HUI of sorts, we would welcome at least one of you to participate on that if you can. But then obviously in your individual capacities, we welcome your full participation, both personally and professionally.
Thank you, Matt.
Susan is also available should you have other specific questions on the interdepartmental work. I know this is a very brief introduction right now.
Okay, great. First, let's open it up for questions from the commission, and then we can open it up to the whole public. Bettina or Chip, do you have questions?
Yes, Chip here. So Matt, what's the rollout on this? And can you go back to some of the earlier slides which give some intro context to it? What's the rollout plan?
Rollout plan. Yeah, so I mean, we're in it already. We had a briefing with the city's resilience team just last month. We will be, this is probably the best one in terms of what's coming up next in this section. We're re-engaging departments on this concept of here's what the information is. Let's talk about your assets and your infrastructures and your plans moving forward. Analyzing the risks on some of these likelihood and consequence scales. within the remainder of this calendar year, we should have these exposure maps, the climate risk assessment, the economics assessment, as well as these 8 community tear sheets. Was that what you're describing, Chip?
Yeah.
Yeah. Susan, any more comment on that?
No, I don't think so. This is the plan. We're getting started in earnest, and so I think we'll have more to say in future interactions.
Yeah.
Is the intention for culminating project or product to be a big report or a website that sort of keeps evolving?
Yeah, both and. No, those are great questions. Certainty on the project website being a place where we want it to kind of also be a version of the output and the final product. For those that, there will be a report, Chip, there will be a final written product, but we want to make sure that we're utilizing any tools that we can to better communicate the information. And in the long term, actually, on the climate resilience and hazard mitigation plan idea, we're learning from other municipalities like New York State and New York City, where they've actually transitioned their plan in entirety much more into an interactive website format. So we're looking for good examples and opportunities to do that as well. But towards the end of this, yes, the project website will exist, and a final written report will also exist.
Great, thank you.
Follow-up question on that. Can you talk a little bit more about the scope of the risk assessment? What kinds of risks are you incorporating into that? And you mentioned there's like the language of exposure. Will there also be like a follow-up to the vulnerability assessment?
I'll give it to Susan for a sec first.
Yeah, so we're defining the risks right now, and that might be one of the things actually that we would be reaching out to whoever, from the commission is participating with us. But we're looking at, kind of some of the obvious sea level rise, flooding, extreme heat in terms of hazards, but then to actually define a risk event, we try to put that into a scenario that we think is a good one to evaluate in a risk assessment context. And so what you can see in this example risk summary, this is actually from work we did in British Columbia. So it's just illustrative to give a sense of like, what does this look like on the back end? But you can see that at the top, the light blue, it says ocean acidification, 0.15 reduction in pH by 2050. That was our risk event that we defined. So we went through a process with them of saying, we're really trying to identify what are the types of hazards, but then like, what is the actual risk event where we think it could be meaningful to understand the risks associated with that. And there's lots of decision points within that of like, are we trying to be really catastrophic in looking at this risk assessment? Or are we trying to look more at like nuisance events that could happen frequently? And so that's what we're working through right now is what are our recommendations given, what we already know, and what we think would be helpful to work through in terms of understanding the likelihood and then the consequences associated with that, with the ultimate goal of, who are we trying to inform? What's the audience here? We're truly trying to feed the outputs of this into the decision-making process for city departments. So we don't have a list yet, but that would be forthcoming. And those are kind of some of the things that we're thinking about as we work to define those risk events. And then, the information that you all have already pulled together in terms of the commission brief and then the national climate assessment and, all the data that's out there is helping us to inform those risk events and how we define them.
And McKenna as well, we recognize that not everything is an event. These are literally just changing defaults. And, the trends are not something that we're trying to just wedge into an event per se. But when we engage with the departments, there's a little bit of back and forth about their knowledge of their systems and what are the triggers and thresholds that are kind of keeping them up at night. And how do we define sort of, the trend of sea level rise or the trend of heat to perhaps develop a scenario of when this is like a very catastrophic or go, no go kind of threshold. So that information is going to also be co-developed with the departments.
Yeah, and then I feel like you had a second half of your question that I just brushed over. Was there another part?
Oh, the other part was about, will there be any updating to the sort of the social vulnerability, the social economic side of the work? But you kind of answered that in terms of characterizing. It seems like through that characterization, you'll get there.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Matt and Susan, in our financial risk white paper, there's a table of hazards, shocks, and stressors. Don't forget to take a look at that.
Yeah, thank you, Chip. I was reminded yesterday in preparation for our panel this afternoon.
Bettina,
And one thing maybe I just want to highlight for the group too is, you know, we're not just sort of staying at this level, something that I kind of glossed over with these adaptation action areas. So the intention is that we will work towards up to about 5 smaller geographies that are not at the island-wide and not at the community plan area. And perhaps some candidates you're probably already familiar with, or departments have been thinking about or scratching their head on. And this is really where we hope that community has the chance to also get involved on like the realism of this stuff and not just think so high level strategy.
I guess I would just add, Matt, that overall, I think it's important to view this scope through the lens of, you know, there's finite budget and time, of course, and there's so much work that's been done, you know, at the city level and at the state level and beyond. And so what we're really trying to figure out here, or what we're trying to accomplish here, is complementing and building on that work that's been done. And so that's like Matt's comments about these adaptation action areas, recognizing that we couldn't do a comprehensive strategy for absolutely every risk that there could possibly be. Our approach was, well, we know that there's a set of adaptation, you know, strategies that need to be developed. So for some action areas where we already really know that there's areas that are vulnerable. We're trying to put a finer point on like, what are the potential consequences? And then we're also trying to put a finer point on what are the potential adaptation strategies for those areas that we already know are issues. So this is not meant to be something where it's a top-down, comprehensive vulnerability assessment, comprehensive adaptation strategy, but we're trying to take a little bit more of a scalpel approach to it, of saying we already have a lot of information, but we're trying to really make it understandable and actionable to the decision makers that need to start moving out on taking action on some of these adaptation strategies, which we're excited about.
If I could, Matt, this has been a great presentation. Susan, it's wonderful to meet you. Sorry, it's only on a postage stamp, but I have a question. You mentioned in the beginning, Matt, that you were looking to possibly have 1 or 2 of the commission members participate in what I understood maybe a key role. Now you look at our commission, we have very distinctly different areas of expertise. Which ones are you looking for? I'm trying not to be quite as leading.
That's not for me to decide, but Bettina, I would say too, in the same way that we are opportunistic pushers of information and engagement, if there's like a sector and you have other venues and forums for convening discussions, we will be glomming on to any of those opportunities as well, in addition to what's defined here as somewhat more of a facilitated discussion with a smaller advisory group, of which we hope that there is at least 1 commissioner on that. But that's not to say that there's not other chances to have conversations with individuals or groups or businesses or et cetera.
Yeah, you're answering it well, because the way I look at this is there's room for all of us. Yep. Thank you.
Okay, with that, let's open it up to anybody for questions.
Hi, it's Layla. I have a question. Hi, Matt. Happy birthday.
Thanks.
So I didn't see the 100,000 tree initiative on your list, but I would assume that that's part of the adaptation strategy, increasing the urban canopy. And I was wondering like what this, yeah, if you guys have already determined like goals in terms of increasing our canopy.
Yeah, so by reference, I would direct you back to the 20-14 directive, which provides some additional information on that. And it's less, the 100,000 trees is more of a campaign and generate excitement, but there's additional goals around actual performance of the community forest around canopy cover. So that's information that we're building out in both this strategy and in our work with the Division of Urban Forestry and Parks and Rec.
Hi, Matt. This is Kathleen. How are you doing?
Hey, Kathleen.
Good. I'm actually talking today, well, at this moment in my capacity as a community member. I just found out that our North Shore Sustainable Community Plan is coming up for review, and they've hired SSFM as the consultant. I've already spoken with them. Climate change is definitely one of the areas that we need to start integrating into our plan. It's imperative. And so I'd like to put that out to you that this is coming up, and we want to ensure that we're integrating and working closely with you guys. So I just want to put that on your radar.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Kathleen. And I've already been in talks with Raymond and Noel at DPP and Melissa May at SSFM about this project. So,
and I'm hoping we'll include one of you guys in the team when we start doing community outreach. So thank you for that, Matt.
Yeah, and we are, you know, I didn't mention it, but obviously we're looking for all of those kinds of moments to engage with a community absent what we were able to do before.
Okay, thank you so much, Matt. I don't mean to cut off if there was another burning question, but in the interest of time, I think we should move on to Lala Nuss's presentation.
Thank you, everyone.
Aloha mai kako, everyone. Ha'ole laha now, Matt. Nice to be able to be in virtual space with you on your birthday. So I'm gonna go ahead and share screen real quick and have about 15 minutes to run through my slides. One moment. All right, can everyone see?
We can see.
Okay, great. So my name is Lala Nuss, and I am the Climate Resilience and Equity Manager for that program within the Office of Climate Change, Sustainability and Resiliency. And what we're looking at right now as far as our role within the program is an intersectionality of work. And our focus is really looking at our compass, which is the Oahu Ola Resilience Strategy, and dialing into specific areas. You can see here the pillars circled that we're most often prioritizing in the work is remaining rooted and community cohesion. And under those items, we're really dialing into components of social equity, whether it's social, cultural, and ecological. So looking at affordable housing, reducing cost burdens and economic opportunities, as well as looking at grassroots resilience, affirming island values, and really integrating our cultural and island components that make us unique here and have proven to be resilient for hundreds of years, as well as island-wide alignment. So just to give you an overview of what is the program, I have to say it is quite emergent and iterative in its form. This is very new for us in the city and county of Honolulu to look at equity and integrating that within our work. We've been lucky enough to be able to have a global network of sustainability professionals and affinity groups that are really focusing and prioritizing equity within sustainability, as well as government policy and operations. So as we've been co-creating with colleagues as well as community members, these are kind of our 4 pillars and what our mission is within our program. So our office is meant to, our program is dedicated to facilitating access, agency, and advocacy within communities. And the idea is that we're increasing participation and representation in our programs, projects, and policies throughout our office, with a larger goal on the horizon that this becomes normalized and scaled up into standards within the city and county of Honolulu. Our 4 pillars are really focusing on community relationships, environmental justice, equitable governance, adaptation, and mitigation. So resilience overall, this is a trend term that can be used in many different forms. And specifically for our office, this is kind of what we are defining and navigating from as far as our definition. And it's really looking at the capacity of our individuals and communities, as well as the institutions and businesses and systems. And the idea is that we're surviving and adapting with the goal of being able to thrive no matter what the chronic stresses or acute shocks. And there's an important component between the relationship between stresses and shocks, right? And we'll go through, hopefully we'll be able to articulate that in this presentation of how those are in relationship with each other when it comes to resiliency. Now, this idea of equity is very fluid and seemingly at face value is hard to really dial in and understand, and sometimes create relationality to or understanding of. And as we learn along with colleagues on the ground, relationships on the ground and internationally, these are kind of the different forms of understanding and language that we're starting to center around that we can normalize within our work. As you can see this image here on the left, what is equality versus equity? A very baseline understanding of equality being everyone gets the same thing, versus equity where things are given based on the uniqueness of the needs, and everyone has, not everyone, but the diversity of needs and where we're at and our abilities is quite diverse. And it is really looking at the correction of our systems in order to eliminate disparities outcomes based on identity. And that's taking in kind of a reflective and internal approach to saying, us in government, what systems are we working with? And what's really working for the community members that we're in service to across the board. And really making sure that we're centering culture and our Kanaka Maoli culture in this effort is looking at from a language or cultural understanding of what equity is. And more the word pono keeps coming up. And the ideal between sameness and fairness. So kind of organizing us further to dial into the dimensions of equity. Nationally, this is kind of the organization of areas specifically that we are looking at that we want to be able to integrate and start practicing it further. And procedural is looking at the inclusive, accessible, authentic engagement and representation in processes, which are developing, which are helping to develop, as well as, to Matt's point, the implementation. And how are we showing that the outcomes are equitable? And these are simple mechanisms and small tools that don't seem hugely, taking on a huge endeavor, but the simplicity of making public meetings and project outreach to be accessible and appropriate for the people and places on the micro community scales, right? So the idea of equity is we're getting more and more granular in many ways with the incredible amount of data we have on national, state, and even island-wide initiatives. Distribution is another one that is focusing on really the programs and policies and the results of their fairness. So again, looking at what are the outcomes and how are we creating metrics and measurements around that. Simple examples of that on the bottom, you can see like we have these amazing solar panel rebates that came out. When we look at the numbers on who was able to take advantage of those, the middle and lower income communities were not represented, were disproportionately not represented in that. So how can we create resources and funding opportunities for the growing number of middle and lower income community members to be able to participate in this adaptation and mitigation process that our office is undertaking. Structural is really looking at how are we institutionalizing equity. And part of that is really looking at our decision makers and making sure they have a contextual understanding and recognition of the historical, cultural, institutional dynamics and structures that have routinely disadvantaged those subordinate, for lack of a better word, groups and advantaged privileged groups historically. What are those patterns and how can we identify them and look to start pivoting in new directions? And we're really excited to be looking at the equitable economic resolution that's going to be heard next week on the 26th. And that is really laying out more in detail what does equity mean, especially in these times moving forward, whether it's with response or recovery during COVID and beyond. Transgenerational, so this is really taking what inherently culturally we understood here as multi-generational approaches to solutions. And that really means incorporating our Kanaka Maoli and communities that know how to practice this and have been doing that for generations to be part of the decision-making as well as implementation. Partnerships are critical in this. Some of the bills that could say represent futures thinking is Bill 40 that we passed, as well as Bill 25. And the last but not least is cultural. So again, centering the understanding of the uniqueness and the vast resources we have that encompass Hawaii. So it's a commitment to undoing discrimination and racism and historical marginalization. And those are looking at specific actions. Action 41 is looking at what are our internal processes to get us to that point of better understanding to be able to make more appropriate decisions. Understanding the communities that our program is prioritizing, and the term frontline communities is something nationally that's being used, and language and communication is key in making sure that we are even communicating our work from an equitable lens. So right now, one of the words that's being used is frontline communities. And these are communities, typically communities of color and low income, whose neighborhoods often lack basic infrastructure to support them, and who will increasingly experience vulnerability as climate events, economic disruption, and health threats, as we're seeing, are predicted to intensify and become more frequent. And you can see the plethora of different types of communities that would be considered frontline or that are inherently, currently, historically, or predicted to experience vulnerability when it comes to climate change and other crises. These are kind of the systematic approach. So looking at systems and really, Matt did a great job on looking at the intersectionality between, say, his program and the current project and the long-term disaster preparedness plan, and those intersectionalities that are critical to start working through in a government setting. So how are we starting to communicate better and lessen our silos, which have been kind of the status quo for a very long time, to really work internally within agencies more collaboratively? And really, again, coming to that point of understanding of what are the realities for our communities and what are the ideals in which we want to move to. The Movement Strategy is an amazing national program that really has tools and mechanisms, this one being an image from the community-driven climate resilience planning that gives us opportunities and frameworks that we can acclimate that are appropriate to place. So the virtual community Kuka Kuka, as Matt mentioned, prior to COVID, our office was about to launch its next community outreach. We are probably one of the most forward-facing, public-facing offices within the city and county of Honolulu, and we take great pride as well as responsibility in that. So COVID happened and we weren't able to gather in large numbers. And simultaneously, the equity program was going to be going into reaching out to frontline community leaders and asking to be invited into community spaces to talk about climate change, resiliency. And with the onset of COVID, we wanted to make sure we pushed this work forward. And so we adapted and pivoted and decided to go virtual. And so reached out to the community, frontline community leaders, and set up listening sessions And again, the idea that our work needs to continually start practicing and evolving into more adaptive, iterative and emergent spaces within government settings. And so kuka kuka, many of you may know, is the word for overall talk story. So it's an exchange of information and knowledge. And really Matt's point of not just having kind of giving word to the ideas of equity, but the actual practice of it and being able to demonstrate that. And this ideally is the beginning of that practice and learning as we evolve and continue to incorporate equitable frameworks into our work. So it was 1 hour listening sessions, and the intention was to gather community knowledge from experiential storytelling. So reaching out to frontline community leaders in the middle of a crisis to ask, how are you guys doing? What's happening? What are your needs? What are your reflections? And how can we as a city agency be able to better understand what community is going through real time during a crisis? So we're really looking at the ideal goal is taking technical expertise and relating and partnering and collaborating with frontline community expertise. And the organizations that we worked with inherently are exactly that. So some of the objectives here, again, prioritizing our frontline communities more and more on a national standard is critical. We're not just looking at the middle, but we're really making sure we're inclusive of and prioritizing those communities that are experiencing an advanced amount of inequity or vulnerable experiences. Community-centered processes, there's more and more of this coming out. You know, there's cities around the world or around the nation, whether it's Portland, Kings County, Boston, even Oakland, that have for the past 10, 15 years been really centering more and more social justice and equity initiatives, whether it's with a commission, whether it's with actual programs and outputs of projects, as well as policy and resourcing. So who was part of this first rendition of our community kuka kuka? As you can see, we were able to outreach to 32 different frontline organizations on the island of Oahu with a total of 60 individual participants. So sometimes we had interviews with one individual and other times we had a group of them to be able to talk story together. And overall, this is the diversity of sectors that were represented in these conversations. And you can see it pretty much covers almost every sector you can think of on the island of Oahu. Many of these being nonprofits and providing critical services that really uphold the social fabrics of our communities. And to honor the names of all of the organizations you can see here, we're really looking at two-way reciprocal regenerative relationship building. And again, this is something that is very new and we're learning in the city and county of Honolulu, specifically in the Office of Climate Change as we move along with guidance from both local community as well as national and international colleagues and peers. And so these are the organizations that we look at as community experts. And so how can we start valuing the community experts as much as, say, the other sciences and technical experts that we have access to? So looking at the intersectionality of those relationships and the potentials of resiliency that can come out of it. So we're looking at how are these organizations impacting and what locations are they impacting? So 8 of them serve most or all of the state and they're headquartered on the island of Oahu. 14 organizations serve the entire island of Oahu. And 6 of them were really Ahupua'a Moku community specific. And we received, not only with the interviews, we also sent out a demographic survey to be able to get some more of the numbers and quantitative data to correlate with the other information. So one of the stark realities that we learned from this process was that pre-COVID, you can see here, 320,000 individuals were being serviced by these 32 organizations. And what's happened since post-COVID or in the midst of COVID, it's been a 30% increase. And for the majority of these organizations, they were already at max capacity. So we're looking at not only 100% of their services and time and energy being used, but we're going over that to 130% now. So how are we going to be able to support those critical services and organizations on the ground is going to be a critical component, not just for our office to understand, but different departments as well as projects taking place. Here's a little bit of demographic for you to understand what types of community members, who is being provided services by these organizations. And as you can see, it's across the board. And if you remember the previous slide talking about who frontline communities are and kind of listing demographics, they pretty much are covering all of those different demographics. And this is the social ecosystem that we really need to start considering as we move forward within our decision making. So dialing in a little bit more to community engagement and kind of the progressive approach to how municipalities around the world are starting to integrate this more officially into their work. So for us, looking at community engagement, again, process, and it's bringing affected people together in support for collective power to win improvement in their community and advance social justice in many ways. Climate equity, if we're specific to our office. And it really is looking at being able to maybe give up a little bit of our power or a conventional way of doing our work within government, which has been historically very top down, and building relationship and allowing community to actually lead in some of these initiatives or be a leader, looked at as a leader in these decision-making areas. Again, it's really looking at supporting community building and leadership already happening. So this is not something where we're coming in and saying, how can we help you? How can we help build you up? It's actually happening already. So how can we participate in government to help continue that resourcing where is appropriate? Wanting to give you a framework to highlight some of the national and local best practices when it comes to this form of community engagement. And there's an amazing organization called Government Alliance on Race and Equity. And they have some really powerful tools that municipalities have been using and incorporating and normalizing within all facets of their government agencies or departments. And it specifically is looking at the sustainability offices taking the lead and supporting that type of development for the broader municipalities. We are a member of the Urban Sustainability Directors Network, which have a key area within equity. And we're actually incorporating an equity foundations training within our office we're currently doing over the next 5 weeks to start this process of learning and practice. And then just a third one, which is doing some amazing work around public engagement. And more, whether it's private or public sector, I'm getting asked questions on like, okay, so how do we do this? This sounds great, but what is the actual process, tools, mechanisms in which we can really start integrating this work into our standards? And then just to highlight and honor some of the local examples that are doing this on more micro scales, Hackbed, who has been a legacy nonprofit organization for a very long time, has been doing this work. So these are the local community experts that ideally we would partner with to practice this further. KUA, as many of you guys know, have been doing a lot of the Aina-based conservation, cultural land management practices, and advocacy work and resourcing work over the years. And then of course, Hanu, really being a solid vessel for the nonprofits that are providing resources for them. And some of the emergent work that's being done and that is reflective or representative of these community engagement practices and components is looking at our Aina Aloha Economic Futures, the Hawaii Green Growth Initiative, Uplift Hawaii, which have emerged out of COVID, and really looking at how are they engaging and how are they getting their information, and then how are they making their decisions. And as well as Complete the Streets, I think has been a great model that's is making a really important effort towards this type of practice. This is just an overview of some of the questions that we asked, and there was a methodology around it specific, but they were really open-ended questions to be able to receive qualitative information and stories back from our community leaders. And again, this practice of listening better is so critical to this work. Some of the method, and I want to honor my colleague, Michael Nguyen, who is a Vista within our program, my right-hand man, without a doubt. Equity work has great depth and breadth to it. So to have one person and now at least two provides a little bit more capacity. But we definitely are looking at, especially with the current scenario and realities, the equity work is going to really need to be resourced and prioritized further. And there are actually, I wouldn't say easy, but there are ways that can do it that are actually lower hanging fruit than we think. So open-ended interview questions, we scribed everything by hand as we recorded and took the interviews in, as well as provided demographic surveys afterwards, and used different components to Matt's point of like, how are we using film or photo or poetry or other forms of data or information to be able to continue to communicate and be inclusive of the many forms of knowledge that is out there. This was manually coded, and again, Michael did the heavy lifting of this. And I do recommend potentially for this type of work that there are some software out there that can be used to make it a bit easier. And then pulling out patterns and themes that were coming out of this. And then first and foremost, it was once we were able to analyze and put together some of the themes and patterns that came out of this, our first kuleana was to report this back to our communities that participated to see if what we heard was correct. These are some of the reoccurring themes that came out. And overall, we coded about 22. And I just want to go over the top 8. And if we're looking at the top 8, everyone said something about community resilience and innovation being critical to their ability to continue to operate. So the top 10 emerging themes, these are some of the specifics that were continually repeated throughout the conversations, and hands down relationships, especially for our communities that are in service to frontline work, so to speak, is the relationships. If it hadn't been for their relationships, they probably wouldn't have been able to move through such a shock due to COVID. Adaptability, again, this idea that we can shift very quickly is critical. And some of the challenges around the barriers and how COVID actually started breaking down some of those barriers that had a nuanced, I guess, mechanism for making us think this is how we do it. This is the only way we know how to do it. And COVID really shook that up and made us shift and pivot to do things we hadn't done before. Distribution is a critical component to what was shared back with us. The concern about staffing, understanding that we do have antiquated systems which cause to an increase in I guess you could say disproportionate disadvantaged communities, whether it's getting unemployment or being able to get local food and those type of social services and frameworks set up properly to be able to respond. Jobs and economy, again, this is another big one that's coming up as far as this being a marathon, and that the concern is looking at making sure we're keeping houses over people's heads due to the unemployment. Communication was another big one. Access to information, whether it was language barriers, 55% of our households on Oahu speak a second language or English is not their first language. And so how are our communications, whether it's with orders coming down or climate change projects or community plans, being able to really reach community members. Technology, another huge one for frontline communities, where that wasn't as accessible, whether it was for school and education or just simply being able to get information. Funding concerns, of course, looking at these being nonprofits, what's going to happen to their, what has been a semi-reliable source of resources to continue these critical programs, and how can we as city and county be able to start understanding that better and looking at recovery initiatives that will directly support the initiatives they're working on. And there was a lot of visions and recommendations, which was really inspiring to be able to hear from frontline community leaders. And many of these community leaders and organizations, these are legacy organizations that have been around for 40 or 50, 40 years. These are just some of the quotes, and to give voice and give life to what we had the honor of being able to receive, as far as just incredible ike of life experience and practice and dedication to resiliency in our communities. The understanding, our communities get it in many ways. The components of social, cultural, and ecological relationships are inherently embodied within our communities. And I think that's something that's really special and unique about Hawaii that we can take further. We should be incorporating with greater importance into our work. Again, the need for listening. How can communities more and more feeling they need to be listened to in different ways, and how can we start practicing that? I love this one quote, and I'll speak this one out loud, is kind of this open door policy, which is very standard within private and public sectors. But this was coming from an educator. And she said she hated that term because it takes the onus off of the leader. It's the responsibility of the teacher or leader to not just have an open door, but to be in relationship with their communities and understand the challenges, concerns, and successes. So it's more of this proactive approach of saying, we're not just setting up a meeting in the city and county of Honolulu in downtown at 5 o'clock on a Friday, but we're actually setting up our relationality and these projects and engagement in their communities. And of course, asking for permission to be able to come in and be able to better provide access for these larger decisions. Barriers and access again. So real quickly, I'll wrap up now. Just wanted to give you some stark numbers real quick on why is equity so critical. This was just released, the COVID-19 eviction crisis. It's estimated that 30 to 40 million people in America are going to be at risk of evictions by the end of the year. This just came out in August. These are the numbers we're looking at right now. And one of the highlights of the report is showing that people of color are going to be disproportionately part of these evictions. And you can see here Hawaii, the numbers that are coming out. So by the end of the year, we're anywhere from 24% to 43% increase in evictions for, this is statewide information for our community members. And just to finalize with this one component of looking at what is our local data looking like from a socioeconomic framework. An update, if you guys are familiar with the Alice report, has been done with Hawaii Data Collaboratives. And pre-COVID, 42% of our population was living paycheck to paycheck. And by the end of the year, it looks like up to 60% could be at that level or below it. So the intersection between COVID and climate change, these four areas of looking at environment and health, self-sufficiency and critical human services, and looking at diversifying our economy and green job sector to be able to really localize and become more resilient against the future impacts. And then really looking at the basic needs being met and covered as we recover as far as housing, healthcare, and food. This is our office real quickly and our organizational chart for the city and county of Honolulu, and looking at where our relationships within that our office has been building over the years and saying like, how can we continue to build those relationships, and really looking at the emergence happening within our city and county with the redesigning of the Office of Economic Development into the Office of Economic Revitalization, which our office had a large role in supporting. And will continue. So intersectional collaborations, these are ways in which we're looking at being able to support this work around equity and community engagement. We're really looking at taking on some of the other municipalities' models of advisory groups and looking at equity huis to be able to intersect with and have them provide their community expertise, whether it's in the climate adaptation plan, the climate action strategy that Matt's working on. We have an amazing education portal that our Vista Taylor's putting together, as well as a disaster plan over the next year. Looking at being able to provide resources and again, the education component, how can we as an office be able to go into community and share this knowledge and be able to process that together? Again, a reminder.
I don't mean to interrupt, but just if I could ask you to, we're getting way off time. I know that people are having to leave. So if you, anyways, but I don't want to wrap up. I don't want to interrupt your main points also, but if you can get to sort of that wrap up.
Yep, thank you. So I think specific to the commission, the work around the equity paper that has been worked on over the past year or so, and saying how can this paper, which is meant to be a form of briefing as well as recommendations moving forward for the island of Oahu, how can we incorporate this type of practice? So really looking at our community kuka kuka hui, saying how can they participate, their communities participate in informing to finalize that report, and then what are the actionable works moving forward, and these are a list of those. And that's it. Thank you for your time, and I apologize for taking a little bit longer than anticipated. Mahalo.
Thank you, Lala. Thanks for the great presentation and all the wonderful work. I'll open it up to questions. Rosie has joined us, I should announce. So Rosie is here. I can keep facilitating the meeting, Rosie, if it's hard to jump in, if that's okay.
Yeah, that would be great. I apologize for being late. We have some family medical issues that I'm dealing with here. So if McKenna could continue to facilitate the meeting, that will give me flexibility should I need to step away.
Okay.
I do have a question for Lala, which is where we discussed an equity statement. And I came in partway through, so I wasn't sure if you had mentioned it in your presentation.
As far as the specific equity statement?
Just a status of where you are on that. If I think I might have missed it.
The equity statement is, I guess you could say, within the equity resolution that we have put forth that'll be coming forward next week on the 26th for public hearing.
Okay, great, thank you.
Other questions or comments from the commissioners? Opening it up to the public. Thank you, Lala. Much appreciated. With that, we'll move to the next agenda item, which is communications and correspondence from the public. I'm not entirely in the loop on this without Vicky here, but Wynn, did we receive any correspondence?
Hi, McKenna. We did not receive any other correspondence or communications from the public in the last month.
Thank you. Then I think we can move to the discussion on the status of guidance guidance documents from the commission. Rosie, can you talk us through where the social racial climate equity paper is?
Yes, so Vicky and I are taking the lead on that document. We have gone through a couple of drafts, and we of course are wanting to integrate the work that Lala's group has been taking in. And so now that she's presented, we're actively going to be working on integrating that. And we also want to be able to actually take testimony and listen to public comments and incorporate that. So that's where we are right now.
Okay, great. All right, well, we caught some time there. I'll give an update on where we are with responding to the request, the June request on guidance regarding kind of, a range focused on social cost of carbon, the guide, I think so, and then a range of kind of what does carbon pricing mean for the city, if I could summarize that letter. Let me share my screen. Oh, actually, I'm sorry, I jumped. Is there any comments from commissioners or from the public regarding Rosie's status update? Okay, now we can move on. Let me share my screen. So this is a guidance document that Bettina and I will be working on with Layla. And we've had kind of one meeting to sort of scope out, you know, what's going to be the contents of this? And Layla's starting to do some of the background research to fill it in. But I wanted just to go through it and to get some high level feedback at this point, and also just to keep everybody in the loop. So, oops. To me, the core of this request is really about providing guidance on carbon pricing and methods for determining cost and value of greenhouse gas mitigation and climate adaptation measures. So it's kind of a lot in there, using the social cost of carbon, social value of mitigation actions, which, you know, in my mind is sort of a sub of the social cost of carbon. So I'm going to keep my presentation more on SCC, and then other environmental and economic modeling constructs, which is broad. So in terms of the outline of the guidance document, this is, you know, the major headings we're looking at, right? First, just really unpacking what does this term social cost of carbon actually mean? And how do we think about some of these, I think, these issues that have been contested within it, right? This global versus local, and I'll talk a little about that next, as well as this issue of time preference, right? Now versus later. And then once sort of going through that, how can it be applied within the context of, you know, within, you know, generally how can SCC be applied, including carbon pricing constructs, but then what does that mean for the city, right? What could the city really do with that? And then we'll have a recommendation section as always. So, you know, the social cost of carbon is generally this idea of a monetary estimate for the social and economic damages of climate change, right? And it really is this idea of sort of an optimal path in terms of balancing damages and benefits, right? And it's normalized to a metric ton of CO2 as a way of sort of stating that in an apples to apples way. So that's the kind of like functional mathematical construct of the social cost of carbon. And it's been operationalized in a number of different ways, right? So the Obama administration, in response to a 2008 lawsuit, developed an interagency working group on the social cost of carbon. It eventually changed its name to the social cost of greenhouse gas emissions. And the idea was this was going to be used as a way to create internal pricing for the federal government to make cost benefit analyses, right? And so we would consider that like a shadow price kind of method, right? It's not that they were using it, at least at this point, to levy an explicit carbon price, but rather for to guide internal decision making. But then the question is what number, right? What is that social cost of carbon? So within the interagency working group, my understanding is they relied on 4 or 5 different integrated assessment models. Within them, I think probably most people have heard of DICE, right? This is the Yale Nordhaus integrated assessment model. That was one of the models included within these parameters, right? And the idea of integrated assessment models is that, you know, they're basically built off of energy economic models, but then incorporate a damage function, right? And it's that climate damage function that's been kind of most contested. And generally, there's agreement that it underestimates the damages of climate change, particularly with the new science coming out in, for example, the 1.5 degree report, right? But back to what I have up here. So this was what came out of the interagency working group in 2016. And if you want to read the whole report, the link is there. So there's a couple things to point out, right? So this is all in $2,000 per metric ton of CO2. And one thing that to point out is it rises over time, right? As well as it's very sensitive to the discount rate that we put in there, right? And the discount rate has been another very contested thing, right? So it's the damage function as well as this discount rate question. What is a reasonable discount rate, right? So the 3% was what the interagency working group kind of landed on as, you know, let's go with this as our benchmark, right? They also looked at the 2.5% and then the much higher 5%. And you can see how that changes the numbers pretty dramatically. Take the 5% in 2050, it's only $26 in comparison to the 3% at $69, right? So this is basically what dramatically changed from the Obama administration to the Trump administration, as well as this issue of, are we looking at global damages or local damages, right? So these integrated assessment models look at global damages with this idea of you're optimizing kind of the global price path to get to sort of maximum net benefits, right? And the idea of focusing on global damages is simply because it's a global pollutant, right? That it's kind of a classic prisoner's dilemma game in economics, right? That if one person only looked at their own damages, you would be underinvesting in mitigation because individually our damages aren't so bad, collectively they're much worse, right? And that's probably particularly true for the US context. So when the Trump administration came in, the interagency working group was disbanded, and two major changes were made to the federal use of the social cost of carbon. One was there was a localization of damages. So the models were updated such that only US damages are considered, as well as they went from kind of the 3% discount rate being what they're taking as the baseline to increasing it actually up to 7%, which dramatically lowers the number, right? So this is a Government Accountability Office report, a GAO report, where they're looking at comparing the Obama administration social cost of carbon to the Trump administration social cost of carbon. It's all at the 3%, just so they can compare apples to apples. But just, so this is basically going from global damages to local damages, and you can see the dramatic reduction in what's being considered now. So already we had a situation where, you know, people have come to the basic, you know, many people came to the basic agreement, it was in the last IPCC report, that the integrated assessment models are underestimating damages to begin with. So these numbers are probably low, right? The Obama numbers were probably low. And now we've moved to a situation where they're made even lower because we're looking at only domestic damages, right? So it would be my strong recommendation that, you know, when we conceptualize the social cost of carbon, it should be conceptualized in a global framework. So in terms of that, and taking that away, then how could social cost of carbon be applied? Just some examples, right? So one is sort of how the federal government intended to apply it. And this is as a shadow price for cost benefit analyses, right? It's sort of in your own internal decision-making in projects, another way to think about getting at true cost, right? True value. So there are examples of states that are doing this within energy regulatory matters, list right there. As well as I brought in just some examples that universities are actually doing this, right? So there's a handful of universities that are sort of making it their capital improvement decisions using this kind of carbon shadow price. They're not all using the Obama EPA social cost of carbon numbers. Some of the universities are actually using higher numbers. I think the highest that I saw was up to $100 per ton. The other way that social cost of carbon could be applied, right, is in an actual carbon price, an explicit carbon price, sort of saying we'll harmonize to that. I mean, I think for the city and county, it raises to me questions like, what does that mean for the city? You know, I don't believe that's within their taxation authority, but that is I think a question mark that I would want to ask CCSR before proceeding. Anyways, and also just I wanted to say that there are other ways to sort of theorize what your carbon price should be set at as well, right? So there was a recent paper published in Nature Climate Change. Noah Kaufman was the lead author, and they're arguing that given all of this contention about the social cost of carbon, you know, the uncertainty in the damage functions, the question mark on the rate of discount, that really we should just sort of not worry too much about that, right? Instead, really concentrate on, you know, what is that date where the science tells us we should be getting to net zero, or however we want to conceptualize that kind of carbon neutrality goal, and then figuring out what pathway your jurisdiction wants to get there. And then from there, optimizing your carbon price, right? And then also redoing this iteratively every few years so that you kind of stay on that path with the proper pricing mechanism. So that's just a recent paper that conceptualizes this a little differently that I wanted to bring up. It is hard to say what that means. That paper was really targeted for national carbon pricing, right? It is hard to say exactly how that would translate to the subnational. Within the national, there is more ability, not perfect ability, but more ability to address issues of leakage than there is at the subnational level, right? Leakage is a pretty big thing when you're talking about between US states. So just finishing up, how just draft implications of thinking this through, right? The city could use a social cost of carbon figure for its own internal cost benefit analyses for projects. I think, we would want to learn a little bit more about how that's done. Matt talked about the budgeting process and how that rolls up within the functional plans and seen through. So how might a social cost of carbon work in that process, right? Is a question mark that I think we want to explore. And I think it also could inform environmental review processes, right? How we think about what comes in from environmental review, particularly with the update to 343 to have a greenhouse gas component and analysis. And then that question mark of, what does it mean to have an explicit carbon price for the city? There are other cities that are doing versions of that, right? And I think we can bring in some of those examples, like I think Austin and Boulder are examples we could bring in that are sort of sub-state, right? Municipal level carbon pricing schemes. But once again, I think we would want to understand the taxation authority of City and County of Honolulu relative to what other places are doing. So that's what I have so far. Questions, starting with the commission? Comments? Chip?
Can you hear me? I changed headphones, yeah?
Yeah.
That was really great. McKenna, thanks. How is the damage function calculated in the future? And it must make certain assumptions about what the future is going to look like. And I'll just stop there.
I can't recite to you exactly, right? The idea is and they're all quite different, right? The scope of the damages that they consider, right? So some focus a lot on agricultural production change, for example, right? Some will incorporate agricultural production and issues of sea level rise or even storm activities, right? So there is a pretty wide berth, and then they are definitely a simplification, right? Which is why they've been pretty highly critiqued. And it's sort of, do we really want to rely on the damage function in comparison to just saying this is what the science says, let's just pick prices that help us get there, right? Rather than trying to do this kind of like quote unquote optimal path, right? So the damage function is one component, right? Whether the damages are large enough, right? Such that you'd be equating $1 of abatement to the actual marginal damage cost, right? And then the other issue is the discount rate in that, right? If you discount the future more, then your damage function is dulled further.
So I have a question about the discount rate, but first, I mean, we're an island setting, not a continental setting, which is a world of difference in terms of vulnerability to the future. And, the future, the next 20, 30 years could be everything from collapse of global trade, and we need to be 100% self-sufficient, to, wow, it's a lot hotter and sea level has risen about 1 foot. But these are widely disparate possible futures. One's about actual survival, the other is about stressors and adapting to them. Mm-hmm. Does it consider, does the range truly consider some of these end member scenarios for the future? Or is it always sort of an averaging, normalizing process that you get from the damage function?
No, it could consider that, right, on a global scale. So, I mean, so the DICE model that I brought up, right, that's kind of the most well-known, it's the longest, it's been, you know, it was kind of the pioneer of integrated assessment models. That said, you know, it's been highly critiqued for having too low of a damage function and application of too high of a discount rate. So the optimal path was getting to too, you know, what is now, I think, well understood as too high of a degree increase, right? It was something like the original, date's fuzzy to me, it was you know, about 3.5 degree increase, right? Which I think all the science from the 1.5 degree report probably just causes a lot of reason to be cautious about that. So anyways, all that to be said is there are sort of newer integrated assessment models or like additional modules of damage functions where you get much, much higher social cost of carbon estimates, hundreds of dollars a ton, right?
What's the discount rate? I don't understand what that is.
It's kind of a mixture of a couple of ideas, right? But maybe the easiest way to explain it is that we all have an internal rate of time preference. Maybe that's not an easy way to explain it, but right, that let me put it in banking terms, even though this is a slight, you know, kind of step from it, right? When you get a 30-year mortgage, you pay a rate of interest, right? And you're making this calculation about how much you're willing to pay in total in order to get your house now, right? And implicitly, you have stated a rate of time preference for consumption now versus payment in the future. And that's what this, you know, conceptually, that's what this is getting at. So there are different ways to sort of think about this. It is definitely very normative, right? It is a statement, and in this context, I think it's important to say that's also a statement of values, right? So there's this sort of like functional element of this is the time value of money, right? But then there's also the how should we put this into policy making, which is quite different, I think.
Okay, thank you.
Well, one thing I'll add, there's like no real empirical or theoretical reason that something as high as 7% should be justified. Questions, comments? Okay, let's open it up. Questions or comments from the public? All right. Well, I have a question. What do you guys think about that as the scope, about the outline response to the guide, the letter? Is that sort of, I'm kind of, you know, wanted to get some feedback before sort of, you know, marching orders to go and write this up into a guidance framework.
What is the social value of tourism? In other words, should we be trying to get maximum number of people here and not counting their emissions?
We should definitely count their emissions, right? Would be something, you know, I think we should definitely be counting their emissions. Actually, I think that gets a little bit into what I kind of glossed over in terms of the social value of mitigation actions, right? And this is that idea kind of builds off of the SCC idea and broadens it a little bit into also thinking about co-benefits, right? So if you have a mitigation intervention, you want to be thinking about the social cost of carbon, but also the co-benefits of that intervention. And so I think that conceptualization could kind of get to what you're asking, Henry, although I feel like I'm skirting it a little bit.
One thing which I got to in our discussion a few minutes ago, do you have either global or local options? Because as an island, I think we have a very strong need for local cost of carbon, but we are at risk of global changes as well. Is there some hybrid?
I would argue no, right? And it's because a global pollutant. You know, obviously this is a point of contention because the current administration just localized it, right? So, but I would argue that it should be, whether the number is right, that's a different question, right? Whether we think that $42 currently number is correct or not, let's put that aside and let's just conceptualize the global versus local. I think, you know, I would argue that the global number is the number to go with because it's a global pollutant, right? As an island, we are going to, you know, enormously experience impacts of climate change. But if we mitigate and no one else does, it doesn't change our damage function one iota, right? Which is why it is a global acting problem that we all need to mitigate, which was the original argument within the integrated assessment model, that it was harmonizing a global price for action.
Thanks.
And
That helped a lot.
I wanted to add, some sections of state law say we should reach net zero within the state, and other sections of law say we should reach net zero globally. That we don't, some sections of law say we should count what leaks out, and other sections of the law say we should not count it. So that adds to more of the confusion.
That's a good point, Henry. Thank you. And Bettina, I saw you had a hand up.
I want to comment on the and you mentioned me as a co-author, which is very kind because clearly what you presented was from the economist perspectives that I let's just say it, purely admire and look up to, and my contribution would be on a completely different level. I got excited about this paper because of the letter with the mayor's directive. It states in there somewhere, with the city having the goal to decarbonize Oahu. And in my head, I looked at, okay, where does the carbon come from? And in how far does my industry, the construction industry, contribute? And what measures do we have within that context that reward the decarbonization trends? And what mechanisms do we have to address those that are not part of the solution? Let's put it that way. There are no examples in Hawaii, but there are a lot of examples worldwide, and now more and more also from mainland municipalities. And we have some numbers. If I would have to put it into, that might be helpful. And if I would have to put it into one sentence, it's basically a carbon tax we're looking at. Developers would be rewarded with future tax reductions, depending on how green, if you will, a building is constructed. There are also, and those of you, this is a sneak peek, those of you that are looking forward to the construction paper, here's a teaser. There are two types of carbon that feed into the building. One is the carbon that is used to build the structure, and then there is the carbon used to run it. And one can be changed over time. The other one is one big decision when one designs it, basically. That's when it needs to be addressed. So yes, that is a small component of the big picture. However, I think it is worth finding maybe a spot in this paper, because 40% of greenhouse gas emissions are being generated in my sector, and that was where my excitement came from. Now, that is much less. It goes in a little bit of a different direction than the paper has now. And quite frankly, I love what you did, McKenna. I really, I think it's fantastic. But the mayor's directive said, okay, what can we do to decarbonize Oahu? And an example could come from the building industry.
Yeah.
So we have options, really. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I absolutely agree. And the building industry is a particularly good example from the way you described it, right? One is an upfront decision that becomes, becomes not changeable or very hard to change later, right? It's really a sunk cost. And one is an ongoing aspect of it, right? And so the way that these kinds of pricing mechanisms or even shadow pricing mechanisms could affect those decisions are a little bit different.
Yeah.
And we could maybe highlight that. So that's great. I should say that I am also working with the Hawaii State Energy Office on the state's carbon tax analysis. So we are doing a statewide modeling effort to understand the effects of a carbon tax in Hawaii, looking at it both from the social cost of carbon perspective, as well as kind of this more, how do we, decarbonize within the state, and what would that rate look like?
Yep, that's awesome.
So I'll have more to say about that in the winter. Other questions or comments? Okay, with that, should move on. We are at our item 7, public input for matters not on the agenda. So if a member of the public has anything they would like to bring to our attention that wasn't covered in a previous agenda item, this is the time to do so. Okay. I think we should do the tentative next meeting date by a doodle poll or something. And I think actually, Layla, there's probably been some effort to set that already through the last sort of long doodle you sent. So I think we can skip that. Agenda item 9, announcements. Okay, hearing none. With that, I think we get to adjourn. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye, everybody. Stay safe.
Take care.
Thank you. Stay safe, everyone.